Welcome to the 2018 Ohio U.S. Senate debate, hosted by WOSU Public Media and by NBC4.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the United States Senate debate between incumbent Democrat Sherrod Brown and his Republican challenger, Congressman Jim Renacci. I'm Colleen Marshall from NBC4 in Columbus, and in conjunction with our studio host, WOSU Public Media, the Ohio Debate Commission, and our broadcast partners all over the state of Ohio, we are pleased to bring you this important political conversation. We are coming to you tonight from the Fawcett Center on the campus of The Ohio State University. There is no studio audience tonight, just the candidates and our panel of journalists. Mike Thompson is the News and Public Affairs Director here at WOSU. Mike Jackson is the co-anchor at NBC4, and Mark Allen is the news anchor at WDTN in Dayton. And we welcome all three of you, gentlemen. And joining our panelists are the candidates. From Mansfield, Ohio, Senator Sherrod Brown. He has served in the U.S. Senate since 2006. And Representative Jim Renacci from Wadsworth, Ohio. Since 2010, he has represented Ohio's 16th congressional district. And gentlemen, we welcome both of you to this important conversation. The candidates have agreed tonight to alternating questions. 90 seconds for an answer, 60 seconds for a response, and then a 30-second rebuttal. By agreement, each will also give a 30-second opening statement, beginning now with Senator Sherrod Brown.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall, and thanks to you, thanks to Mr. Allen, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Thompson on the panel. Special thanks. We're joined, and certainly to the voters of Ohio watching tonight. We're joined by my daughter, Emily and Elizabeth Brown, and Connie Schultz, my wife. I'm hopeful this debate will address issues, will stay on issues, and that we can discuss especially what we can do as a senator for Ohio families. I thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And Congressman Renacci, would you please give us your opening statement?
Well, thank you. And I want to thank the Debate Commission. I want to thank NBC and the affiliates and all those here today that will be asking questions. Again, today's debate will show two different people with two different visions. My vision is always for Ohio first and for Ohioans. My opponent's vision is for Washington first. And of course, his Democratic Party, and in many cases, his special interest money. Two different people, two different visions. I welcome the cameras and the people to get to know us both.
We thank both of you. And the candidates also agreed tonight to something a little out of the ordinary. At the start of each half hour, one of the candidates will have the opportunity to ask the other a question on a topic of their choice. The other candidate will have 90 seconds to respond. And by prior agreement, we begin with Senator Brown, who has his question for Representative Renacci.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Congressman Renacci, 11 people every single day in Ohio, 11 Ohioans on the average, 11 Ohioans every day die of an opioid overdose. 11 died yesterday, 11 are dying today, 11 will die tomorrow, 11 will die Monday. Senator Portman and I bipartisanly have worked together for several years on combating this terrible public health threat with the CRIB Act, with the Interdict Act, with the STOP Act, with the CARE Act, with a number of pieces of legislation, many of which will be signed by the president in the next few days. My question is, you have attacked my work with Senator Portman against this public health crisis. What specifically do you think that Senator Portman and I have done wrong about this?
Well, thank you for the question. Again, my heart goes out every day to those that are lost with the opioid tragedy. And one of the things I've done to try and look into this is set up a panel of people who have been addicted and recovered, a panel of people who have lost their children, which is so sad, and then a panel of people who also have worked with the recovery. What I've said all along is that we need to be talking to the people. We need to be making sure that we're listening to the concerns. Number one, we need to talk about Daryl, who opened up the medicine cabinet and found opioids in that medicine cabinet. Or Michael, who is a businessman who lost his entire business because he opened up that cabinet and looked at those. Those are policies that we need to change. We also need to look at the parents who have lost their children. And when they lost their children, they tell me that the first thing that they ran into after their child came out of the center for recovery center was the drug dealer was right there handing them opiates again. These are the issues we should be looking at. And then the recovery centers. It's not all about money. The big concern I have is that when it comes down to money, these centers, they will tell you it's not a 6-month transition. In some cases, it's a 5-year transition. So we should be looking at the ways to change our policies in Washington, not always talking about money. Money helps, of course, but policies can change things, whether it's our education system, which opens up opportunities for VOTEC and allows somebody like Darrell to see other opportunities other than just the opioids that he went to. Those are opportunities that we can do and we can change. My heart continues to go out when I pull this panel together and realize how many people we are losing. We need to be able to work together. I promise to do that as your next senator.
All right, thank you, Congressman. And now I'll begin with the first question, and it goes to you, Senator Brown. The yearly federal deficit is approaching $1 trillion. That's $779 billion a year, 17% increase. So far, the tax cut that went into effect this year has failed to increase tax revenue to the levels expected or promised. At the same time, U.S. military spending has increased, contributing to the rising deficit. So would you support either reversing the tax cut or cutting military spending as a means of reducing the deficit?
During the debate on the tax cut, I went to the White House. A dozen of us met with the president. I suggested to the president we pass legislation that we passed my Working Families Tax Relief Act, which gives tax cuts to the middle class, not to the wealthy. You build the economy from the middle out. And I suggested the Patriot Corporation Act, that if companies play by the rules, if they pay their workers well, if they provide good insurance, health benefits, and retirement, they get a lower tax rate. This Congress, then the president said he liked the idea. Then the special interests went to work in the back room in the majority leader's office and the speaker's office. We ended up with a tax bill where more than 3/4 of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%. People like my opponent who thinks this tax bill is great. But the fact is that this tax cut, I would vote to change this tax cut so we focus on the middle class. We don't focus on giving tax cuts to the richest people in this country.
Congressman Renacci, your response?
Well, again, the difference between myself and my opponent is the tax cuts are working. As I travel the state, I see jobs being created. I see businesses continuing to grow. I'm happy to see that we now have employers who are giving employees. My opponent doesn't seem to be traveling the state and talking to the same people. I come around and I get thank yous from people saying, I now have more money in my paycheck. And they love to see that. At the same time, we have to have a strong military. We've let our military go down. So we need to be able to keep both. Listen, the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill gave us that 4.3% growth. We need to continue the growth and the jobs. We need to continue our economy growing. You go back into the late 90s and you'll find when we were actually balancing our budget, it was because of 6.2% growth, 6.5% growth. It was growth. We need to continue to move our growth forward. And I'm proud to say that I support the Tax Cut and Jobs bill because that's what will continue us to grow this economy and get us out of this deficit. We do not want to go back to the days, the last lost decade, as I call it, that Senator Brown and Barack Obama supported, where we had 1.8% growth. We had deficits continue to grow. And we do have to look at spending as well. Let's face it. We have a problem in our spending. We will have record revenues in the Treasury this year, record revenues, but we also have record spending. And I think until we evaluate our spending, but not defense spending, because defense spending has been let go for many, many years, we need to make sure that we're continuing to grow this economy, continue to have the job growth that we're having. We'll be able to grow our way out of this in many ways, and I think that's what we should continue to do.
And your response, sir?
I judge an economy not by corporate profits, not by the stock market. Of course, I hope there are corporate profits and the stock market does well. I judge the economy by what's happening with workers' wages. We've seen profits go like this. We've seen executive compensation explode. We've seen productivity go up, but workers aren't sharing that wealth. Wages are flat, and what Congressman Nacey doesn't tell us is once this, as soon as that bill was signed by the president, the bill that 3/4 of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%, Republican leadership immediately said, well, we've got to cut Medicare and Social Security or raise the eligibility age to pay for it. So in other words, they're advocating, Congressman Nacey's advocating, as is Republican leadership in Washington, advocating that we cut taxes on the wealthy, predominantly cut taxes on the wealthy, and it's paid for by hardworking Americans through a more difficult retirement because of cuts in Social Security and Medicare.
Right now, Mike Thompson has a question for Congressman Renacci. Mike?
Congressman, you say you support a market-based replacement of Obamacare. But most economists would say that in order to mandate that insurance companies cover pre-existing conditions, you either have to require people to buy health insurance or you have to have a government program to subsidize the uninsured. Otherwise, people just wait until they're sick or they're hurt to buy health insurance. How will your market-based system of health insurance work without government help?
Well, first off, I want an Affordable Care Act that is affordable. I want to look, today the Affordable Care Act isn't working. Premiums have gone up 132% for Ohioans since the Affordable Care Act was put in play. That's not affordable care. We have now taken care of a program that we absolutely take care of those in a safety net, and I'm okay and proud to do that. And the wealthy can pay their own way. But the problem is, Mary in the middle with 3 children, she can't afford her premiums and she can't afford the deductibles. We need a system that brings competition in, that brings transparency in, and bring costs down so everybody can afford it and have access to it.
Senator?
The most important thing to do with the healthcare system is to deal with the cost problem. High costs are driving the cost of Medicare. High drug costs especially are driving the cost of Medicare. This Congress does nothing to take on the drug companies. You've got a Congress that's the White House looks like a retreat for pharmaceutical representatives, for drug company CEOs. But the other thing is, Congressman Renacci more than 20 times has voted to eliminate the consumer protections for pre-existing condition. 5 million Ohioans, more than half the adults in this state, have a pre-existing condition. And so Congress, he has voted 20 times to take away, as Mr. Thompson suggests in his question, to take away those consumer protections for pre-existing conditions. So if he had had his way on this vote, if John McCain hadn't stepped up and stopped it with his key vote in the U.S. Senate, the insurance companies would be able to deny coverage to people with cancer, deny coverage with people with Parkinson's or with diabetes or with osteoporosis. That's morally wrong. It's bad economics. It's bad healthcare policy. You'll never get the costs under control if we don't take on the drug companies for spiking costs the way that we do, and if we don't fight back against the insurance interests who are trying to allow cancellation of policies of people with pre-existing condition.
And your rebuttal, sir?
Well, again, the senator is lying. I have never said we need to get rid of pre-existing conditions. In fact, I've supported legislation to make sure it stays, the pre-existing conditions stay. But let's face it, he also talks about lobbyists, which is amazing. $500 million he's received from these lobbyists, the same lobbyists who are lobbying for prescription drugs. So again, these lies don't come to truth when it really comes down to we need to make sure that health care is affordable. We need to make sure that we are taking care of pre-existing conditions, and we need to make sure that the middle of the road, mom and pop that are fighting every day to cover their children can afford it and pay for it.
Mike has a follow-up.
Congressman, could you elaborate more on how competition and transparency will bring health care costs down?
Absolutely. Look, the best example I can give you is LASIK eye surgery. You know, there was a time where there was no competition in LASIK eye surgery. The prices were extremely high, and then all of a sudden there was competition. Today you have competition. Today you have billboards. Today you have costs that almost down to a couple $100s. This is how you bring competition down. And by the way, you have to have transparency. Look, the biggest problem we have in our healthcare system is nobody knows what they're paying for when it comes down to. I was at the dentist the other day. He told me I had to do another x-ray. Nobody knows what the cost of those x-rays are, but he said it's covered. That's where we need transparency.
All right, now we go on to Mike Jackson, who has a question for Senator Brown.
Senator Brown, this question comes from Nidia. She's from Columbus, and she has a lot of concern about a lot of social issues we're facing today. She's particularly concerned about the relationship between our community and our police department. She wants to know, what approach would you take to improve both the drug problem that we currently face and the increasing racial divide?
Thank you for that question today, and to you, Mr. Jackson. I've been endorsed by the Fraternal Order of Police because I sit and listen to police officers and talk about the issues that they face every day. I've also been endorsed by all kinds of civil rights groups for the same reason that I sit and listen and talk to them about the issues they face. I think you start in part with the social issues that whether it's Appalachia or whether it's the inner city in cities in our state face. We have a government in Washington that continues to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people in this country. We don't invest in infrastructure. We don't invest in community policing. The governor, I know, when the governor candidate, as Attorney General, has cut training for not spending money on training for police officers. And much of this, police officers want to do a good job. There are a few bad apples as there are in politics and anywhere else. But we don't focus on training. We don't focus on community relations. I know in Columbus they're working hard, that city council and police departments are doing that. But we've got to deal with the issues of housing better than we do. We've got to deal with the issues of income disparity and inequality than we do. But we have a government in Washington that cuts funding on housing. We have a government in Columbus that does the same. We have governments that give tax cuts to the wealthiest people and forget about helping struggling people, working families.
And your rebuttal, Congressman?
Well, again, I do think we have a divide, and especially in the inner city. And it's one of the reasons why I started the program called Opportunity Cleveland up in Cleveland. It's where you take youth and you start to make sure they have the opportunity to not only see mentors, but also see opportunities. And by the way, the best way to change this is a growing economy, to continue to make sure our economy is growing so jobs are around, so people can continue to find good jobs, good paying jobs. And then we need to direct many of our youth into those good paying jobs. Look, career politicians, Republicans and Democrats over the last 20 years have forgotten that it's not only about going to college, it's about making sure you have a career path that gives you the opportunity to live the American dream. We can do that if we allow people to see other opportunities other than college, have good mentorship programs inside the city, and have opportunities for youth to not only see police officers and be part of that and see how they do it, but also other opportunities as well.
Senator, you talked about the relationship with the police department, but I'm sorry, rebuttal. I'm sorry.
Okay. The other day I was speaking with, I met a fellow named Chad at a community picnic Connie and I went to in our neighborhood in Cleveland, and Chad had gone to a vocational school. He had gone to a proprietary school, it's called, to learn diesel mechanics. And he's doing well. He's got a pretty decent job, he says, that pays decent wages. But he's got student loans that are still pretty oppressive. And whether you go to Columbus State or Ohio State, whether you go to Otterbein or whether you go to Sinclair Community College or whether you go through apprentice program, you are faced with these high student loans. My opponent voted to deny 25 million Ohio Americans a chance for lower interest rates on their student loans so they could pay these back. How do you get working families, give them the opportunity if that's what we're doing?
I think Mike has to have a follow-up.
Okay, sure.
Senator, so many families, they already know about the challenges and the student loan debt. What would you do directly to try to improve this for the people you represent?
I would work on sentencing reform. I would work on ban the box, which I've done with Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. I would work on issues of, I oppose the efforts of the Republican Party all over the country to try to suppress the vote and roll back voting rights. There's clearly an attack across the board on all of those kinds of civil rights issues that undercut the relationship police and the community are trying to build. When you have a federal government that doesn't seem to care, it's awfully hard to build the relationship that police officers are trying to build and community leaders in Columbus and elsewhere are trying to build.
We're going to go now to Mark Allen, who has a question for Representative Renacci.
Colleen, thank you. Congressman, good evening.
Good evening.
We journalists have reported on countless mass shootings here in the U.S. in recent years. Almost without exception, within the next day or two, we learn of some degree of mental illness in the background of the gunman. As a first step in reducing mass gun violence here in America, is it time for Congress to keep guns out of the hands of the mentally ill?
It's interesting, and my heart goes out for those that we lose because of this type of violence. But you also mentioned something that's very important, mental illness. When I first got into the business world, and I was in the business world for almost 3 decades, I actually had facilities that took care of the mental health. The problem is our state and federal governments decided we were not going to take care of those with mental illness. And those facilities had to actually tell these individuals they could not stay at the facility any longer. So where did they go? They went out on the streets. Now they're in our prisons, they're out on our streets. My heart goes out because we do need to make sure we're changing our issue. We need to look at mental health. We need to look and make sure that mental health individuals are taken care of. We have a safety net for a lot of others. We need to make sure there's a safety net for those. When it comes to gun violence, we should be looking at background checks and making sure the same thing when someone has mental illness in their background, that they don't get those guns. These are things I can agree with and will continue to talk about. That's where we need to go. But it comes down to this mental illness issue that we seem to have forgotten about, and government has seemed to have forgotten about as well.
Senator?
Every time there's a gun shooting, defenders of the gun lobby send their thoughts and prayers to the victims, as we all do and as we all should. But then they refuse to close any of the gun loopholes. Get this, if you're on the terrorist watch list, if you're on the government terrorist watch list, you go out to John Glenn Airport in Columbus, you can't get on a plane, but you can buy an assault weapon. And you know what? We've tried to close that loophole time and time and time again in Congress, so mothers don't have to be afraid of sending their children to school. We've tried to close that loophole, and every time the gun lobby steps up, and every time Republican members of Congress defend the NRA and defend the gun lobby, they get tens of thousands of dollars in contributions. In fact, the gun lobby spent, we think, we don't know because it's all dark, undisclosed money, millions of dollars against me in my campaigns. But all these loopholes, assault weapons and the terrorist exemption and bump stocks and universal background checks, all these modest common sense reforms that Congress should be doing, that 80 or 90% of the public wants to do, the gun lobby blocks it because they have a Congress that's in the pockets of the gun lobby.
Again, my opponent continues to talk about lobbyists, and he's collected almost $27 million this cycle from lobbyists. The truth of it is, it gets back to the issue he continues not to talk about, which is mental health. And that's where we need to go. We already have cities that are gun-free. We already have a place in Washington, D.C. that was gun-free, that a member of Congress was shot. The problem is, if you look at the background of those individuals, there's mental health issues that we need to be taken care of. And we need to make sure we're redirecting our resources in that area.
Do you have a follow-up, Mark?
Colleen, I do. Congressman, back to my original question regarding keeping guns out of the hands of the mentally ill. Part of the challenge here, of course, is defining who is mentally ill. I mean, thousands, millions of Americans are treated for things like anxiety and depression. Would they be included in that group? Where's the line? Who draws that line?
Well, again, I think we've seen that in many, many cases where there is gun violence, too many times it's communication, too many times it's communication when it comes to mental illness. What we should be doing when it comes to mental illness, we have doctors who treat these individuals. We have individual friends who see it. There's a lot that can be done when it comes to just looking and comparing, and looking at our friends. Look, this is about continuing to make sure we are doing what's right for those law-abiding gun owners, and at the same time making sure we're taking care of those with mental illness.
Yeah,
you can do it.
Mr. Allen, that's exactly the point about mental illness. I hear over and over and over again, we've got to focus on mental health. Of course we do, but the people saying that, always in the pocket of the gun lobby, the people saying that are the same people that vote to cut spending on Medicaid over and over and over. I've stood with Governor Kasich, a Republican. I'm a Democrat, as most people know watching. I support him strongly in his expansion of Medicaid. Literally 500,000 Ohioans have gotten mental health treatment because of Medicaid expansion, yet Congress wants to cut that, and Congressman Nacey's first in line to try to cut it.
We're going to move on now to Mike Thompson, who has a question for Senator Brown.
Senator, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, has stepped up enforcement in Ohio since President Trump took office. Our region has seen a 36% increase in deportations in the first year of the Trump administration. Some Democrats call for the abolishment of ICE. Do you think ICE should be abolished? And how should we properly enforce our immigration laws?
No, you shouldn't abolish ICE. You should reform ICE and make it work better than it is. I take a backseat to no one in enforcing our borders with technology, helicopters, better trained ICE agents. The bill that I worked with, that I went to the White House to, when the president signed it, the Interdict Act, to keep fentanyl and carfentanil from coming across our borders as best we can. But you don't do raids on people who are working hard and playing by the rules and let criminals who are here let them stay. I mean, the focus of ICE, the focus of the administration should be on deporting those people who have committed violent crimes. There are a whole lot of workers in this country that are not, that don't have documentation. There are millions. There should be a path to citizenship that they should earn, pay back taxes, all that. But these are people working hard. They're active in their church often. They're supporting their family. They're paying taxes. They're paying into Social Security. Instead, we deport people like that in what the administration has done to break up families, to rip children from their parents, from their families, is immoral and just bad, stupid policy. When my wife and I were talking one day, we have 4 small grandchildren. At that age, if they were taken from, when you think about children being taken from their parents, at that age, they don't even know the names of their parents in the city in which they live. Yet the government has ripped those kids from their parents and split up those families and doesn't seem to have any interest. And Congressman Renacci's never stood up to it and talked to his friend, the president, and said, let's aim this policy. Let's be a more humane nation when it comes to splitting up families.
And your response, sir?
Well, the senator again says he takes a back seat to no one, yet he does accept a lot of lobbyist money, and that's where he takes that front seat from. Let's face it, the senator supports sanctuary cities. That is not something Ohioans support. The senator supports no borders. That's something that Ohioans don't support. And look, the senator is again lying when he says that Jim Renacci didn't say publicly that we shouldn't be separating the children at the borders. I said that. I disagree with our president. But again, taking a back seat to no one, he's also saying that illegal immigration doesn't matter. He's saying that people that come here illegally, that they should be able to continue to work and provide. They're illegal. They're here illegally. Look, Sandy was in a plane with me flying back. She said, please, and coming back to Ohio, she is an Ohioan, please do not let illegal aliens get ahead of me. That's what's important. Let's make sure we have a legal system that allows a process for people to become legal citizens and not let illegal aliens just step in and come here.
And Senator?
Yeah, just for the record, and you're going to hear this over and over about campaign contributions. Every race I've ever been involved in, I've been outspent. All the outside money, the gun lobby, the tobacco companies, the oil industry, Wall Street that came at me in 2012. I don't whine about that. I chose to do this for a living. Just again, to put on the record, 155,000 people have contributed to my campaign. The average contribution is $42. And I take a backseat. I termed that term before, but I take a backseat to no one standing up to Wall Street and the drug companies and the oil industry when they attack the middle class in my state.
Thank you, Senator and Congressman. And we are taking one break during this program, and we're going to do that now. We'll be back in 60 seconds with Congressman Renacci's question for Senator Brown.
NBC4 is the authority for local elections, getting your questions answered before you vote this November. Tune in on October 21st at 9:30 a.m. for the matchup between House District 15 candidates Rick Neal and Steve Stivers, moderated by NBC4's Colleen Marshall. NBC4 is your local election headquarters.
Now you can get your weather updates whenever you want, hands-free on your Amazon Echo. Sign up for the Storm Team 4 skill and get local weather whenever you want. It's that easy.
When all eyes are on your neighborhood and you need information fast.
We're tracking this line of storms that could bring us some damaging winds. When accuracy means keeping you and your family safe.
Are voters just numb to all of these scandals? When you want perspective and for the powerful to be held accountable.
Explain some of the issues that you've been trying to deal with. When you're frustrated and you need answers.
When you want the stories behind the teams you love.
When you need more, choose the station that's local for you. Choose NBC4.
Welcome back to the U.S. Senate debate between Sherrod Brown and Jim Renacci. At the top of the hour, Senator Brown asked a question of Congressman Renacci. Now it's Mr. Renacci's turn to ask the question, and Senator, you will have 90 seconds to answer.
Senator, the Marietta Times this week had an editorial about domestic violence, and the editorial said one time is too many. In December of 2016, you asked Senator Franken to step down when it was learned that it was a substantiated sexual assault issue. You asked him to step down. Archie Parnell, he's a candidate for Congress in South Carolina. Congressman Tim Ryan said because of domestic abuse that happened to him over 40 years ago that he needs to step down. They said that that is not a standard of conduct that can be tolerated in the House or in the Senate. Senator, do you believe any instance of domestic violence or sexual assault disqualifies anyone from not only serving in the House or Senate, but serving in a public office?
Congressman Renacci, I've answered that question numerous times with you, numerous times. My former wife has asked that you stop attacking our family. The state's newspapers have asked you to stop making these kinds of disgusting allegations. You should be ashamed of yourself.
My question now goes to Congressman Renacci, and it happens to be in the same area. Your campaign and you have made quite an issue out of the decades-old allegations of domestic allegations involving Senator Brown and his former wife. You justified that by pointing to court documents, public records, and you said that was the reason that this should be part of the public discourse. Public records show Ivana Trump made allegations of physical and sexual assault against Donald Trump during their divorce in the 90s. In sworn deposition testimony and in pleadings that were filed with the court, those allegations were made. There is demonstrable evidence of infidelity involving Mr. Trump. By your own reasoning, should that have disqualified him from serving in public office?
Well, first off, I would say that I don't believe that any man that touches and harms a woman, that is just unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. Number two, forgiveness doesn't mean it didn't happen. Number three, in the cases that I'm discussing with Senator Brown, these are documents. These are documents which show evidence of abuse with affidavits and also restraining orders. You can't get a judge to get a restraining order if something didn't happen. And in 2016, as I said earlier, he asked Senator Franken to step down because of allegations of sexual assault. Look, Senator Brown does not get grandfathered in on this issue. When it comes to the president, if the senator wants to run against the president in 2020, he can use that information against him. But this race here is about Jim Renacci and Senator Brown, and it's about whether he is disqualified to be a United States Senator because of accusations that, by the way, I know he has said that Jim Renacci has lied. Well, that means he's saying that the judge lied. When there is a restraining order, that means there's enough evidence to prove these things. So in the end, I think Republicans, Democrats, Independents, if they violate and they put their hand on a woman, none of them should be serving in the United States Senate or the House.
A brief follow-up, sir. You really didn't answer my question. Should it have disqualified President Trump from public service?
Well, I did answer your question because I said the same thing. This isn't about President Trump. Look, there are a lot of things about President Trump that he says or does that maybe I don't like, but I do like what he's doing in the economy. So in the end, if that's what wants to be used in the 2020 campaign, it can be used. But right now, we're talking about a Senate race. I'm not running for president. And again, if I was running for president, I've just said anyone, Republican, Democrat, Independent, who lays their hand on a woman disqualifies them from being in the House and the Senate.
All right, our next question for Senator Brown comes from Mark Allen.
Senator, would you support a measure that would totally ban PAC money from election campaigns, thereby reducing the overall cost of campaigns and elections, which I think we can all agree are spiraling out of control, and make this vital process in our democracy more insulated from outside influences?
Absolutely, we should limit the amount of money in campaigns. The Citizens United case by this Supreme Court, by the sitting Supreme Court at the time, that just opened up the spigots, so all kinds of corporate money, all kinds of undisclosed so-called dark money. And I know it firsthand. Again, no complaints here, but in 2012, more money was spent against me by these special interests than any Senate race in the history of the United States at that point. The record's been broken since. But it's so important for people's voices to be heard, to begin to limit the money that we can spend that people can spend in campaigns. Democrats have tried repeatedly to overturn the Citizens United case. Senator McConnell, who is one of Congressman Renacci's biggest cheerleaders, Senator McConnell has blocked us from any efforts to try to overturn the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, which would limit money. So we should limit contributions. We should limit expenditures. We should certainly limit the outside dark money that comes into the state. I was Secretary of State a number of years ago. I led the charge to try to restrain big money in political campaigns in those days. I've been trying to do this for years. Unfortunately, these interest groups weigh in. They put their thumb on the scale. The Supreme Court continues to put its thumb on the scale of justice, supporting corporations over workers, supporting Wall Street over consumers, supporting healthcare companies over patients, and supporting the big dark money in politics that washes over this whole system. That's why that tax bill that went overwhelmingly for the wealthiest people, that's why that bill passed, because of special interest influence in Washington, and that's why I opposed it.
Congressman?
Well, look, I've always said that the easiest way to change Washington is two things. Eliminate some of this PAC money, especially the $27 million that my opponent has received, and put in term limits. Look, in 1997, my opponent even believed in term limits. The reason why you have to have term limits before you eliminate PAC money is because it would give nobody an opportunity to be able to compete with the ability to be able to raise money and to be able to turn around and run a campaign. We should look at eliminating as much money as we can. It is absolutely unbelievable that my opponent can raise $27 million. He used to be the #1 candidate for raising money in the Senate. I think he's $500 short of being #1. But the truth of it is that is causing us problems. So I'm all for term limits, which eliminates these career politicians who raise $27 million, and at the same time allowing people to get their message out in the best way they can without spending $27 million attacking their opponent.
Senator?
Again, 155,000 different contributors averaging $42 each. Congressman Renacci has a little trouble with the truth. I mean, he made $13 million and didn't try to avoid paying taxes on it until he got caught. He pals around with his crooked businessman in Canton who gave him $100,000 until he got caught. He was a lobbyist when he came to Congress, something I'd never seen before, until he got caught. He's had a little trouble with the truth, as he has in this campaign, as he has for the last 8 years in Congress, and I think that speaks for itself.
Mike Jackson has a question now for Representative Renacci.
Thanks, Colleen. Representative, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has updated its report on the situation, and it says the situation is getting worse. President Trump has said in the past that climate change is a hoax. This week, he does not deny climate change. It could go back. He said the climate change scientists have a political agenda. Mr. Renacci, do you agree with him?
Well, look, here's what I do believe. I believe in making Ohio first and making sure we're protecting Ohioans. We do have to make sure we have clean water and clean air, and we have to have all the above, whether it's nuclear, whether it's wind and solar. We should be looking at all those. But we shouldn't be taking away, as Senator Brown wants to do when he was running around with Hillary Clinton, who was running for president. We shouldn't be trying to bankrupt the coal industry, which is important to Ohio. We should be actually growing the oil and gas industry, which is important to Ohio. That's why I stand with Ohio first and Ohioans. I do believe the other thing is you start to eliminate some of this coal and some of this oil that the Senator Brown would like to do. And by the way, again, when you talk about money, he's collected so many money from the special interest climate control area that he should, when he's probably cashing the checks that, he's forgetting about the people of Ohio. We cannot allow our costs of energy to go up. by eliminating some of the assets that we have, which is clean coal, which is clean natural gas, and which is clean opportunities for jobs here in Ohio. So do I believe we need to make sure we protect our environment? Absolutely. Do I believe we need to make sure that we're protecting Ohioans and their costs of electricity? Absolutely as well. That's why I stand with Ohioans and Ohio First.
I'm proud that Ohio it has sort of all of the above. We have, I've traveled in my made in Toledo union-made Jeep to Western Ohio and seen wind turbines in Van Wert and Paulding. We have one of the greatest solar centers manufacturing in Northwest Ohio and Toledo. We really do have all of the above. But here's the thing, your question connected to Mr. Allen's question about all the outside dark money. The fact is, the Koch brothers, which is this big this huge behemoth corporation, mostly an energy company, owns the Republican Party lock, stock, and barrel. They can't even acknowledge that what 99% of scientists say, what most of the world's countries say, that climate change is a very real threat. Look at the problems, look at the weather patterns recently. You don't have to have great insight to see what this is doing to our planet, the costs it brings to the federal government and to those communities that get hit with wildfires and to hurricanes and tornadoes and all the things brought up. It's something we should do. Congress won't do it because they're handcuffed by special interest money.
Congressman?
Again, my opponent continues to go back to special interest money, and he seems to want to disregard the $27 million he's gotten from the environmental groups. Look, when it comes to me, I want to make sure Ohio's first all the time. I want to look toward Ohioans. I want to make sure that the coal industry is growing here, clean coal. I want to make sure that the oil and gas industry is booming. I don't want Ohioans to have extra costs in their electricity because his special interest groups want him to ban coal and want him to ban oil and gas. He wants to talk about the Koch brothers. He should be talking about those that are donating to him.
Mike Thompson now with a question for Senator Brown.
Senator, the federal gas tax stands at 18 cents a gallon. The tax on diesel fuel stands at 24 cents. It has not been raised since 1993, and because of inflation, that money now can basically purchase half what it could then. And cars and trucks also are much more efficient, which means less gas tax money as well. With roads and bridges and highways in need of repair, would you support increasing the gas tax? And should more of that tax money go to pay for mass transit, which would lessen the burden on roads and highways?
Congressman Renacci has sponsored a bill to increase the gas tax, which is a tax mostly on middle-class Ohioans and working families that need to drive 10 or 20 or 30 miles to work. At the same time that he votes to give tax cuts to the wealthiest people. I've said this before, but it's important to keep thinking about that 3/4 of the benefits in that tax bill, more than 3/4 of the dollars in that tax bill, went to the wealthiest 1%, people like Congressman Renacci, and then he turns around and wants to raise the gas tax. I have come up with a plan with 5 other senators, similar to what the president campaigned on. He's not really moved on it yet. A $1 trillion 10-year infrastructure plan paid for by closing tax loopholes, investing in our communities. It's clear that this state government, corrupt as it is, has failed on taking care of our highways and bridges and our roads and our water and sewer systems and our airports. We need an investment in infrastructure, but you don't do it by taxing working families. You do it by closing tax loopholes. Right now, if you shut production down in Mansfield or Garfield Heights or Grove City or Newark and you move overseas, and open a new factory there, you can collect a tax break. Close those loopholes, invest those loopholes in infrastructure. Don't put it on working families. Put it on those people that have abused the system in the past and that could afford a few dollars out of their pockets.
Your response?
Well, I wish the senator would have read my bill, because what it actually said was we need to put an inflation factor on the gas tax. Would have amounted to less than a penny. And then we need to force Congress over the next 4 years to come up with a plan and force them to do it. The problem is the senator has been around for 25 years. This problem continues to grow. And sadly enough, every child born in the Columbus hospitals today is going to pay for the problem that he is allowing to occur. We need to make sure. We had a hearing in the House. They said we need a user fee. There's only so many kind of user fees. There's gas tax, there is miles driven, there are weight, and there are tolls. Everybody, Republicans and Democrats on that panel, agreed that we needed a user fee that works and make sure we're protecting our children and grandchildren in the road. We should be paying for the roads that we're using. My bill just was forcing Congress to do something, and it gave them 4 years. That's the difference.
Thank you, sir. Representative Renee, oh, I'm sorry, your response.
I hear Congressman Renacci continue to talk about the federal budget deficit. He said he was an architect of this tax bill that went to the wealthiest people in this country and caused stock buybacks to reward corporate executives and gave a 50% off coupon to companies on their taxes for companies that shut down in Columbus and move overseas. They save 50% of their gas tax. But that blew this huge hole in the federal budget deficit. And the leaders in Congress want to close that budget deficit by cutting Medicare and Social Security. You give tax breaks to the richest people, and then you stick it to hardworking Americans that have paid into Social Security and Medicare their whole lives. I think that's bad economics, and it's just wrong.
Representative Renacci will now get a question from Mark Allen.
Arlene, thank you. Congressman, there was actually a time, and it seems like a long time ago now, when compromise was not a dirty word in Washington, D.C. Rather, it used to be the way that things actually got done. In this day of great partisanship, little trust and middle ground, and both sides seemingly dug in for the long haul, how can Congress do the work that the voters, your employers, elected you to do?
Well, thank you, Mark, and I want to thank you for that question. Look, when I first went to Washington, I had no plans of going to Washington. I went there because my car dealership was taken away from me. And in the first hearing I got to, I saw Republicans and Democrats going at each other. When it came to me, the first thing I said was, why are we doing this? I want to listen to the witnesses and I want to move forward. And I asked, and at the end of the hearing, a gentleman from the other side, John Carney, walked over from Delaware and said, I appreciate what you did, and so many other Democrats appreciate what you did. Let's have breakfast, and we did. That breakfast has turned out to a weekly breakfast, a weekly bipartisan breakfast. And I am now one of the most 14%, one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. Every bill that I get, I try to bring a Democrat on board by compromising. And in the end, you don't have to compromise your principles or your values to get some things done. And I'm proud that group has gotten over 15 bills through the House and 7 that have been passed by the House and Senate and actually signed on by the President. These are the kind of ways we need to be able to work together. The real problem is when somebody like my opponent gets to Washington and is there for 20 to 30 years, and then his allegiance is more to the party and to his leader, that's when we don't get things done. And what I found out, even in my bipartisan group, was that even the senior members used to say, this is a good idea, but I can't do it because Nancy Pelosi's against me doing it. That is a problem. I've shown the leadership. I'm going to do that in the Senate as well. I believe that'll be the first thing I do, is to try and find people on the other side that I can work with and start having breakfast with as well.
Senator?
Yeah, congressmen will always show up to eat and to talk about bipartisanship, but let's look at what we actually do. I'm first senator in Ohio in 50 years to serve on the Agriculture Committee. I grew up milking cows on a Guernsey farm near Lexington, south of Mansfield in Richland County, 50 miles, 60 miles from where we stand. I went to work on this farm bill. It's a farm bill. It's a family farm bill. It's a conservation bill. It's a rural development bill, and it's a nutrition bill. I worked with Senator Grassley and Senator Ernst, Republicans from Iowa. I worked with Senator Thune, Republican from South Dakota. I worked with the chairman, Pat Roberts from Kansas. We crafted a bill that got 86 votes out of 98. 2 senators were absent. 86 out of 98, more votes than had ever passed, that had ever been in support of a farm bill. Then the bill went to the Congress and the House of Representatives, and they passed a partisan bill. We do it in the Senate. I know how to work. I've passed Russia sanctions bills with Senator McCain. I could go up and down the list of how many Republican senators I've co-sponsored. Only 3 senators in the last session of Congress introduced more bills that became law. Only 3 senators did more bills than I did. That tells you a lot about bipartisanship.
And Congressman?
My opponent likes to talk about the bills he does. I get that. The sad thing is, it's more about the bills that you get accomplished. I've actually been able to accomplish more when it comes to bills in my short term in Congress than he has over the last 25 years. The real issue here is when he talks even about farmers. I don't understand this. You could put a bill up every day, but when the farmers say to me they're tired of the regulations, they're tired of the water bill, they're tired of their attack when they go to transfer their farm to their family and they pay a death tax. These are the things that I'm going to stand up for when I'm with Ohio farmers and make sure Ohio's first, not Washington and Washington first.
Mark, I believe you have a follow-up.
Gentlemen, that all sounds great, but with all due respect, and I'm trying to think, what would the voters say if they were sitting in my seat? The most recent example we all saw was the Kavanaugh hearings. I mean, it was, none of us have ever seen anything like it, as far as I can't think of this country being any more divided than we appeared to be watching that hearing play out on national television. Why are the voters to believe it's going to get any better? How does it get better? What's the first step? Who's going to make the first step?
And we'll give each of you 30 seconds to respond to that. Congressman?
Oh, I'm sorry. Look, I will tell you right now, that Senate hearing was a travesty. You had senators who already agreed to vote no, but they were causing all these issues. And then they take a guy with unsubstantiated claims and say he can't serve. These are the kind of problems. You want to fix it? We need to get term limits in place, and we need to eliminate people who are around for 25 years like my opponent, so that we can start having people who represent Ohio, not represent special interests, not represent their Democratic Party, and not represent Chuck Schumer.
And Senator Brown?
Yeah, I find I've heard Congressman Nacey over and over say how much he hates Washington, and that's fine. But I think it's because he went to Washington for the wrong reasons. He was a millionaire that was upset about his car dealership, and he went to Washington. He says that. He went to Washington and fought to help millionaires and billionaires. I went to Washington many years ago. I acknowledge I went to Washington many years ago to fight for health care. I promised I'd pay my own health insurance until Congress passed health insurance, universal health care. I paid my own health insurance for more than a decade. I don't own any corporate stocks. Connie and I don't buy corporate stocks because I'm the senior Democrat on the banking committee, and I think it's a conflict of interest. If you could get the conflicts of interest out of this Congress, it would be a whole lot better place.
And Mike?
Senator Brown, President Trump himself has called this midterm election primarily a referendum on him and his first 2 years in office as candidates with your names on the ballots. Do you agree?
I don't. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I don't engage in political punditry. I work hard to serve my constituents. I don't really play in terms of if this is good for Trump or that's bad for Trump. I've worked against presidents in both parties when it comes to trade agreements. I oppose NAFTA, I oppose CAFTA, I oppose PNTR. I'm working with this president with whom I disagree most of the time. I'm working with him on renegotiation of NAFTA and tariffs and all those trade issues. So I run for office standing on my record. I wake up every day figuring how do I fight for Ohio workers, regardless of whether they work in an office or a school or a factory or a construction site or in a factory of some sort. I make those calls based on what I think is good for Ohio. I know President Trump carried this state. I've carried this state twice, and I will continue to work to earn that trust.
Congressman?
Well, thank you. And again, I think in the last election in 2016, there was a referendum on what is going on in Washington, and that's why President Trump did win. There were people that started to realize that they were being forgotten. Even though Senator Brown talks about how he is working for those people, it seems like Ohioans rejected that because the senator traveled all over the state of Ohio with, at that time, Hillary Clinton saying, Hillary Clinton's for the working family. Hillary Clinton is going to protect your wages. In the end, Hillary Clinton was going to bankrupt the coal industry, Ohio coal industry. So look, 2016 was a referendum, and that's why Hillary Clinton lost, who Senator Brown said that he was so sorry to see that happen. Well, I think Ohioans have understood that doing the same thing over and over again, electing the same people over and over again, doesn't really mean the senators representing Ohioans. I will always support Ohio first and Ohioans.
And Senator?
Yeah, I see a Congress that continues to weigh in on the side of corporations over workers and Wall Street over consumers, whether it's the Supreme Court nomination where that's happened, whether it's the Senate leadership which wrote a tax bill that overwhelmingly gave the special interests all this money, whether it's energy policy, whether it's health care legislation. The drug companies get away with murder in this state, frankly, with the prices they charge, and whether it's prescription drug consumers or financial services consumers, this government has sold them out.
That was our final panelist question. We begin closing statements now with Congressman Renacci.
Well, again, I want to thank the Debate Commission. I want to thank the Channel 5, and I want to thank the moderators here tonight as well. Look, in 1997, a United States congressman said that the biggest problem Ohioans have is they send people to Washington and they spend 20 to 30 years there and they forget about the people in Ohio. That congressman was Congressman Sherrod Brown. And the truth of it is, he has forgotten about Ohioans. He has voted, he's the fourth most liberal senator in Ohio. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes 96% of the time with Chuck Schumer. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes 94% of the time with Elizabeth Warren. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes for sanctuary cities and supports sanctuary cities. That doesn't represent Ohio. He votes for partial birth abortions. Ohioans don't believe in that. In the end, he ran around the state in 2016 supporting Hillary Clinton, who wanted to bankrupt the coal industry. Look, as your senator, I will always think about Ohio first and Ohioans. I will make sure that I get up every day and want to continue this growth of 4.3%, continue the job growth that we're experiencing in this state. I want to make sure that Ohio is that place that it was when I came here 35 years and started my first business. I want to make sure that those 53 employees that Senator Brown forgot about in my dealership understand that I'm going to protect them. This is where our difference are. I want to support Ohio first. I want to make sure I'm supporting Ohioans. And again, on November 6th, I hope I can earn your vote.
And Senator Brown.
When you love your country, you fight for the people who make it work. I get up every day ready to make that fight for all Ohio workers, whether you punch a clock or swipe a badge, whether you work for tips or whether you work for a salary, whether you're raising children or whether you're caring for an aging adult, an aging parent. And I hear repeatedly that people are squeezed. I hear it in the grocery store. I hear it when I pick up a prescription for Connie. I hear it in factories. I hear it in office buildings where people think this government is rigged against them. They see businesses shut down in Dayton and Xenia and move overseas, build a factory and collect a tax break. They see a government, the Congress that rams through a special interest tax bill where the money goes to billionaires and millionaires, but then they see a congressional leadership say we got to pay for that tax cuts for the rich by cutting Medicare and Social Security. People are angry about that for a reason. They see special interest groups have their lobbyists and there's loopholes and there's not much left for working families in the middle class. Washington doesn't really understand the dignity of work. I do. I think if people get up and play by the rules, they ought to be able to get ahead. If people work all their lives and they try to save for their retirement and they contribute to their community, they ought to have a safe and secure retirement. I want your hard work to be rewarded so that people can have higher wages and better health care and a secure retirement, protecting Medicare and Medicaid. That's why I ask for your vote. Thank you.
We want to say thank you first to both of you for being with us, Congressman Renacci and Senator Brown. And we sure thank you for joining us tonight. This was the second of 3 debates between the 2 major party candidates for the United States Senate, Democrat Sherrod Brown and Republican Jim Renacci. Their third and final debate is set for this coming Friday, October 26th at Miami University in Oxford. Thank you to our panel of journalists, Mike Thompson, Mike Jackson, and Mark Allen for being with us. Thanks to WOSU, to the Ohio Debate Commission, and to all of you for joining